The dim dormitory. A black coffin slides in, slow as a funeral march. Its lid cracks open, blood trickling from the seam. Jihan's hollow eyes stare straight into us. Then, we cut to the massive Stardome arena. 3,000 spotlights blaze to life. Red and blue vests weave through the chaos, blades flashing like falling stars, the screams climbing in waves. Finally, the camera zooms in on a single capsule ball rolling across a flower-patterned floor, a key inside glinting with a white, lethal shine. After the brutal failed uprising that closed out Season 2, 60 survivors are dragged back to the dorms. Jihan is the only rebel spared. His friends hang overhead, displayed like trophies of defeat. The air is thick with the stench of failure. When the new game is announced, red team as hunters, blue team as prey, 30 minutes to slaughter or be slaughtered, everyone understands this isn't just survival. It's a spectacle designed to wring out the last scraps of their humanity. The episode is titled Keys and Knives, but what makes it so harrowing isn't the upgraded rules. It's watching what happens when every bond has already been shattered and there's nothing left to lose. In a show the world has consumed like candy, where violence became just another bingeable thrill, Season 3's first episode quietly turns the camera back on the ugliest parts of ourselves. Those who swore to protect each other now drive knives into the hearts they once promised to shield. This is a story about guilt as fertilizer, about hope as poison, about how sometimes the most devastating thing isn't dying, but realizing we're no longer capable of love or rage. And yet, the most unsettling question hangs over all of it, embodied by the front man's blank stare. Why keep Jihan alive? Is it to force him into becoming the next executioner, or to watch him rot in the knowledge that no soul is worth saving? No one knows the answer. And maybe that's exactly what creator Wang Dong-hyuk wants us to confront. That in this game, the true winners never step onto the floor. It's easy to forget now, with Squid Game etched into pop culture like a scar, that this story was never meant to last this long. When Wang Dong-hyuk first pitched the series, he imagined a single season, an allegory about debt, shame, and how capitalism feeds off desperation. The runaway success forced his hand. Netflix practically begged for more, and he found himself staring down a question he'd never planned to answer. What happens after survival? In interviews, Hwang confessed that Season 2 nearly broke him. He struggled to balance fan expectations with his instinct to avoid repetition. It's why Season 3, particularly this premiere episode, feels different, meaner, colder, more claustrophobic. If Season 1 was about being trapped by poverty, Season 3 is about being trapped by the past. The production itself was an endurance test. The giant Stardome arena, where the deadly Keys and Knives game unfolds, wasn't CGI. It was built piece by piece over 9 months, a hand-painted canvas stretching the size of a soccer field. The crew spent weeks perfecting the way the lights refracted off the swirling blues and yellows, a twisted homage to Van Gogh's Starry Night. Hwang has said he wanted the arena to feel like a place you dreamed of as a child and a place you die in as an adult. Casting choices also carried their own hidden tensions. Lee Jong-jae was hesitant to return as Jihan, worried that playing the same character over so many hours would turn into self-parody. Lee Byung-han, who plays the frontman, insisted on making his character colder, less an evil puppet master, more a void of empathy. Their scenes together were often shot in grueling 12-hour stretches, with the crew instructed to keep the set temperature near freezing to help capture the numbness of trauma. Even the script evolved in ways that surprised the creators. Originally, the first episode didn't feature the mother-son dynamic or the pregnant contestant's birth. Those were late additions, sparked by the writers' debates over whether there was any point at which survival instinct should surrender to basic decency. They couldn't agree, so they wrote both possibilities into the story. In the end, Huang split what he once imagined as one colossal season into two. He admitted he didn't want to, but the story felt too bloated to cram into one single arc without losing its teeth. That decision, splitting season 2 and 3 just 6 months apart, has shaped this finale into something that feels both inevitable and unsettling. Like watching the last seconds of a bomb countdown, knowing you helped set the timer. From the first frame, the visual language of keys and knives announces that this isn't just another round of death games. The camera never lets you forget how small the players are, how vast and predatory the world around them has become. One of the most striking choices is the way the lens keeps drifting upward, framing the dorm and the arena from overhead. It's the gaze of an indifferent god, or more likely, the gaze of the audience itself, complicit and curious. The production design doubles down on that moral discomfort. The arena's swirling blue and yellow roof is almost pretty, almost comforting, until you realize it's a calculated contrast to the carnage happening below. Hwang Dong-hyuk has always been fascinated by childhood imagery turned sinister. But here, the effect feels more grotesque, like a fairy tale rotting from the inside out. When the lights hit just right, the painted stars look like they're weeping. The players' costumes sharpen the symbolism further. Red and blue vests echo the South Korean flag, hinting at a national split, an echo of past civil wars and unresolved traumas. But in practice, those colors have nothing to do with ideology. They're just another arbitrary lottery, another way to turn neighbors into enemies. That's the point. As the frontman says while swirling whiskey, the more familiar they are, the faster they'll betray each other. Take the sequence where Ji-han chases Dae-ho through the maze of plastic partitions. It's one long, unbroken shot, 7 minutes of raw desperation. The camera sways and stumbles with them, never cutting away as Ji-han screams accusations and Dae-ho begs for mercy. On paper, it's a simple confrontation, one man blaming another for his grief. But visually, it becomes a thesis statement. No matter how many times Ji-han says he hates the system, in this moment, he's just another cog, repeating the same cruelty he vowed to destroy. Character arcs also deepen this sense of tragic repetition. Joon-hee's storyline, a pregnant woman forced to fight or die, should be the emotional core, a chance for empathy to survive. But even she ends up clinging to alliances that are transactional, not moral. She trades promises of protection with Myung-gi, her ex, knowing full well he's using her as leverage. The moment she tells him, "If you die first, I'll at least get to choose when I go," you see how far the show is willing to push its characters past any traditional notion of hope. And among the new faces, the most quietly terrifying is the mother-son pair Gum-ja and Yong-sik. Their dynamic flips the logic of previous seasons. In season 1, parental sacrifice was framed as a final act of love. Here, that same instinct is weaponized. Yong-sik joins the red team, thinking he'll protect his mother by hunting others, but she hides a knife of her own, prepared to kill him if she must. Their standoff, lit in soft pink and blue, feels almost too intimate to watch. Even the mechanical doll duo Chol-soo and Young-hae are more than just a nostalgia gimmick. When Chalsu's infrared eyes sweep over the arena, the red beams resemble searchlights in a prison yard. Every game in Squid Game has always been about surveillance, the thrill of being watched, the fear of being exposed. This time, the doll doesn't just detect movement, it seems to judge it. Players freeze not only to avoid death, but because they can't bear the idea of being seen at their lowest. That's the real horror of this premiere. Not the knives, not the countdowns. The horror is in the spaces between. The moments when the camera lingers just long enough to show you who these people have become. It's the realization that survival doesn't erase guilt. It just buries it deeper until the only way to feel anything again is to spill more blood. One of the most remarkable shifts in this episode lies in the structure itself. Unlike previous seasons, which unfolded with a steady rhythm, game, reprieve, game again, Keys and Knives plays out like a fever dream. Time becomes elastic. The episode lingers in moments of paralysis, Jan lying on the dorm floor, the soft drip of blood from the coffins, then snaps forward without warning into chaos. This pacing isn't accidental. It mirrors the psychological reality of trauma, where time either stretches unbearably or collapses into panic. Hwang Dong-yuk seems determined to deny the audience any comfort. The cuts between the arena and the VIP lounge are more jarring than ever. In earlier seasons, those cuts offered ironic relief, a grotesque reminder that rich outsiders were gambling on human suffering. Here, the transitions feel designed to humiliate us. One second, a mother cradles her newborn in the corner of the maze. The next, a champagne glass clinks in the VIP suite as a new bet is placed on how soon she'll die. It's hard not to notice the visual echoes of Hwang's earlier work. The wide-angle shots of bodies arrayed like puppets call back to his 2011 film Silenced, itself a meditation on institutional cruelty. The difference is scale. In Silenced, the violence felt private, a secret shared among abusers and victims. In Squid Game, the violence is a spectacle, broadcast to the world and willingly consumed. Hwang seems to be asking whether public horror is really any less perverse than hidden horror, or if it's simply more honest. Thematically, this episode hammers home the series' signature contradiction, that the games are both a transparent critique of capitalism and a perfect metaphor for it. The red and blue teams have no ideology, no cause, just colors assigned by chance. And yet, the players are convinced that survival demands loyalty to their side, even if it means hunting down someone they love. This is what makes the scene between Young-sik and his mother so harrowing. It's not just a fight for life. It's a demonstration of how easily the illusion of a team can override everything human. Critics have argued that the show sometimes flirts with nihilism for shock value, and there's a case to be made here. The birth subplot, Jan Yi's baby wailing in the middle of a blood-soaked maze, feels almost too on the nose, as if the writers wanted to shove the metaphor directly down our throats. New life born into cruelty, innocence weaponized as bait. But the uneasy feeling it leaves behind is exactly what makes Squid Game so difficult to dismiss. You can't watch this episode and pretend you're just here for thrills. If there's any single moment that defines this installment, it's the 7-minute continuous take of Gion pursuing Daeho. The choice to avoid cuts isn't just an aesthetic flex. It traps us in real time, forcing us to watch every second of Gion's transformation. He starts as an accuser, hurling blame to ease his guilt. By the end, he's something closer to a predator. Daeho's sobbing pleads, "I didn't run, I froze, I swear," become a kind of soundtrack to Gion's collapse. Even when Gion finally lowers the knife, the relief is poisoned. He hasn't rediscovered compassion, he simply realized there's no satisfaction left in retribution. This is the psychological core of Season 3, the understanding that revenge, even if justified, can't resurrect what you've already lost. The critics are divided. Vulture praised the episode's commitment to dread, calling it a masterclass in sustained discomfort. The Guardian was less charitable, dismissing the VIPs as flat caricatures that undermined the show's moral weight. But both agree on one thing. This premiere signals a deliberate pivot away from simple survival drama into something bleaker, more existential. The question isn't whether the characters will live, it's whether there will be anything left of them if they do. When you zoom out, you can see that this episode is a thesis about cycles. Cycles of exploitation, cycles of betrayal, cycles of spectatorship, ours included. The final shot, with Gion whispering, "It's your fault," before the arena doors slide open, is more than a cliffhanger. It's an indictment of the system, of the characters, of us, for watching. And that's the unsettling genius of Squid Game. It never lets you pretend you're separate from the spectacle. It keeps reminding you that in some small way, you're part of the same machine. If you strip away the surface-level horror, what's left in Keys and Knives is a meticulous study of systems, how power consolidates, how people justify their worst instincts, and how no one emerges unscathed. This isn't just an isolated nightmare on an island. It's a controlled simulation of the same forces that operate in the real world. At the heart of it is Gion's downward spiral. You see the seeds of his transformation as far back as season 1, a man desperate to believe in some version of fairness, even when the evidence screamed otherwise. By this episode, that last shred of faith has withered. The game doesn't just test his body, it proves to him with surgical precision that morality is a liability when survival is the only currency. That's why the frontman's test, forcing Gion to consider executing Daeho, lands so hard. It's not an order, it's an invitation. The episode is clever in how it refuses to paint the choice as simply evil. If you squint, you can see the cold logic. Daeho's mistake arguably doomed dozens. Executing him could restore the illusion of control. But even contemplating that act changes Gion. The camera locks on his face in unbroken close-up, showing every twitch of disgust, every flicker of temptation. This is where the show becomes something closer to an autopsy of conscience. The mother-son duel, Gunja and Yongsik on opposite teams, is another thread that weaves the episode's central question. Can love survive when all incentives are aligned against it? The moment Yongsik spots his mother hiding behind a plastic partition, the tension isn't whether he'll kill her, it's whether he'll hesitate. Because in the game's design, even a second of hesitation is an exploitable weakness. That's how the show indicts the system itself, by proving that human connection is the flaw that the powerful can harvest. And it's not just an abstract idea. The visual language hammers it home. The overhead shots transform the arena into a diagram of an economic engine, each player a disposable part, each action reducing risk for the ones in control. The bright colors, the whimsical set design, they're a camouflage for a system built to make empathy a liability. Hwang's choice to film the brief scene with that same candy-colored lighting is a quiet provocation. Even innocence can be commodified if the game demands it. This episode also peels back more layers of the frontman himself. Earlier seasons hinted at his motives: guilt over winning, envy of those who died clean. Here, he's evolved into something more chilling. A man who believes he's doing Gion a favor. When he tells Gion, "You'll thank me when the burden of caring is gone," he's not gloating. He's convinced he's offering a mercy. That conviction is what makes him so unsettling. He's a character who sees humanity as a disease that must be cauterized for survival. It's worth noting how this resonates beyond the show. Squid Game has always been a mirror for the structures we accept in daily life: workplaces that reward betrayal, economies that feed off desperation, institutions that mask cruelty behind rituals. This episode takes the metaphor further by removing any pretense of fairness. The red and blue teams are assigned randomly. The players can't negotiate their conditions or appeal to any authority. It's a closed circuit of exploitation with no exit but death. In that context, the newborn baby becomes more than a cheap symbol. It's the show's bleakest thesis that even the future isn't exempt from the machinery. When Janhee holds her crying child in the middle of the maze, you can almost feel the air go out of the room. The camera pulls back to show the dolls scanning for movement, the VIPs placing new bets. It's a tableau of total commodification, life reduced to a spectacle, innocence stripped of any sanctuary. And yet, there are flickers of something else. Daeho's breakdown, Goomja's refusal to run, Gyeon's decision to lower the knife. These moments don't redeem the characters, but they remind us that even in the most rigged system, there are decisions that aren't dictated by logic or self-preservation. They're small gestures, easily crushed, but they exist. And that sliver of unpredictability is what the game, and by extension, the systems it critiques, can never fully erase. By the final shot, as the arena doors rumble open and Gyeon advances with the knife half raised, the episode has circled back to its central paradox. Survival isn't victory, it's just another phase of surrender. The only choice left is whether to betray yourself along the way. And that's the cruel genius of this installment. It doesn't offer closure or catharsis. It forces you to sit in the unease, to feel the weight of complicity. It makes you wonder what you'd do if the rules were set against you, and whether in some quieter way they already are. One of the most unsettling threads in this episode is how it insists on connecting the violence on screen to the audience watching at home. It's not subtle. Every cutaway to the VIP lounge is framed so that the viewers in their masks resemble us. Anonymous, comfortably detached, eager to see what happens next. In earlier seasons, this was a satirical flourish, a way to lampoon decadent elites. Here, it feels more like an accusation. The arrival of new VIP characters, especially the American recruiter played by Cate Blanchett, raises the stakes of this dynamic. She doesn't cackle or brag about her wealth. Instead, she studies the screens with the calm interest of someone observing a behavioral experiment. It's the banality of her gaze that lands hardest. When she murmurs, "They always pick the same moment to break," she's not just talking about the players. She's also talking about how predictable the public appetite for suffering has become. And this is the episode's most effective critique, that the machinery of exploitation doesn't need overt villains. All it requires is people willing to watch, to rationalize, to look away when the price is too high. The show keeps returning to that image of the giant capsule ball, something that looks like a toy, but contains the seed of someone's death. It's a metaphor for how systems of control sugarcoat their violence, making participation feel innocuous. Consider the moment when the newborn's cries echo through the maze. It's one of the most divisive scenes in the franchise so far. Some critics called it manipulative, a cheap emotional shortcut. But from a thematic standpoint, it functions as a perfect trap. The baby's existence forces everyone in the arena to declare, in action or inaction, whether their own life matters more. It's a scenario designed to expose the limit of each player's moral capacity, and by extension, the audience's willingness to judge them. That same question of responsibility hovers over Gi-hoon's arc. His refusal to kill Daeho might look heroic in a vacuum, but the episode complicates that reading. When he lowers the knife, he isn't sparing Daeho out of compassion. He's simply realizing that no outcome will absolve him of guilt. The frontman knows this. That's why he orchestrates the test, not to create a winner or a loser, but to prove that survival can be as corrosive as defeat. Throughout, the episode underscores the idea that power doesn't just corrupt the individual, it warps the entire moral landscape. The red team doesn't want to be murderers. The blue team doesn't want to be victims. But the designer of the game leaves no alternative. And once you accept the premise that some lives must end so others can continue, it becomes almost impossible to see any choice as innocent. That's the true horror Squid Game keeps returning to. Not that people can be cruel, but that systems can make cruelty feel like necessity. This is why the debate over moral culpability in the series is so heated. Some viewers insist the players have agency, that every betrayal is a personal failing. Others argue that the real villain is the architecture itself. Hwang Dong-hyuk seems to deliberately avoid resolving this tension. Instead, he layers the episode with images that resist a single interpretation. A mother pointing a knife at her son, a father watching his newborn become a liability, a man who wants to die but keeps surviving. Each tableau is both indictment and confession, daring us to look away. The final minutes of the episode are a masterclass in dread. As the arena gates crank open and Gi-hoon takes a step forward, the soundtrack doesn't swell. There's no triumphant chord, just a low ambient hum that feels like the inside of an anxiety attack. As if the show wants to remind you that no catharsis is coming, that the cycle will continue until someone finds the courage to break it. But who is responsible for ending that cycle? The players? The organizers? The audience? Squid Game refuses us to pin it on any one group. Instead, it suggests that power and complicity are more entangled than we'd like to believe. When we watch people fail in impossible circumstances, we're participating in the same dynamic that destroyed them. We're the crowd in the VIP suite, sipping champagne while telling ourselves we'd never sink that low. In the end, that's the most subversive aspect of this premiere. It doesn't just critique systems of exploitation. It shows how those systems rely on ordinary people doing nothing. By drawing us into the spectacle, by making us care, it implicates us. And it leaves us with the sickening knowledge that in some way, we too have picked up the knife. You can watch Keys and Knives as a dark parable about strangers forced to hurt each other, but its true resonance comes from how uncomfortably close it feels to the world outside your screen. Because while the stakes are fictional, knife fights and neon death traps, the underlying dynamics are chillingly familiar. Think about the arbitrary division of the red and blue teams. It's a dramatized version of what real societies do every day. Assign labels, declare who's in and who's out, then pit those groups against each other for resources that were scarce by design. Whether it's class, race, or nationality, the colors change, but the principle is the same. The fact that players believe they can protect their loved ones by joining the hunters is especially revealing. It echoes the way people justify participating in systems they privately despise, telling themselves they're doing it to shield their families from the fallout. And the baby in the maze, so many critics called it heavy-handed. Maybe it is, but it's also painfully honest. Because in reality, children are often born into systems that see them less as lives to be nurtured and more as collateral. You don't have to look far to find examples. Refugee camps where kids are a bargaining chip. Hospitals where care is rationed by profit margins. Courtrooms where the future of a child is decided in the time it takes to sign a document. The show exaggerates these dynamics, but it doesn't invent them. One of the reasons Squid Game hits such a nerve globally is because it arrived during a time when millions of people were grappling with their own survival games. The pandemic exposed how brittle many safety nets were. Essential workers risked their lives while executives worked from vacation homes. Employment spiked while billionaires saw their wealth balloon. For a moment, the dividing lines were too obvious to ignore. Watching strangers forced to play games to survive felt almost uncomfortably literal. This new season seems determined to underline that connection. The VIPs are no longer cartoonish caricatures of decadence. They're clinical, rational, detached, qualities that mirror real-world technocrats who can calculate suffering in spreadsheets. Kate Blanchett's recruiter feels less like a Bond villain and more like an IMF consultant who can tell you exactly how many people must go hungry for a policy to be sustainable. That's the scariest part, the realization that the most destructive power often comes not from sadism, but from the serene conviction that you're simply running an efficient system. The show also speaks to a growing cultural fatigue with narratives that pretend individual virtue alone can dismantle entrenched exploitation. Earlier seasons flirted with the idea that empathy and solidarity could offer a way out. Season 3 seems more cynical. When Gi-hoon lowers the knife, it's not framed as redemption. It's framed as a temporary stall in a machine that will eventually crush everyone. That's why so many viewers felt queasy rather than inspired after the premiere. It feels truer to how many people see their own societies, as engines of harm that can't be escaped through a single heroic gesture. And yet, there's a quiet kind of hope embedded in that bleakness, because if the game is designed to make compassion impossible, then every moment of hesitation, every refusal to play by the rules is an act of resistance, however small. It doesn't redeem the system, but it reminds us that systems are not natural laws. They're constructions. And what can be built can also be dismantled. This is where the show's most urgent question comes into focus. What happens when the spectacle becomes too familiar? When the audience becomes numb to the violence, or worse, addicted to it? Squid Game doesn't offer an answer. It simply forces us to reckon with the fact that we're already participants. We click play, we pick sides, we consume suffering as entertainment. And when the credits roll, we tell ourselves it was only fiction. But the social currents that feed the show, rising inequality, political polarization, the commodification of everything, are real. The baby crying in the maze is a melodramatic flourish, yes, but it's also a provocation, daring us to ask whether we do any better in the same conditions, whether we already are making similar compromises in subtler ways